name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, amen. Come, Holy Ghost, and fill up the hearts of thy faithful, and enkindle in them the fire of thy love. Send forth thy Spirit, and they shall be created, and thou shalt renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. God, who once by the light of the Holy Ghost instructed the hearts of thy faithful, grant us by that same Holy Ghost to be truly wise and to rejoice in his consolation. Through the same Christ our Lord. Amen. Our Lady, Seat of Wisdom, pray for us. Saint Peter, pray for us. Saint Paul of the Cross, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. I'd like to thank Father Berg for this opportunity to speak to his parish. Originally, we had talked about me flying up there and giving a talk or something. That didn't quite happen due to this, to the big virus scare that we are living in. But I remember, Father Berg, well, that I think the first vocation retreat that we did in the North American district was given by me, a young graduate of Thomas Aquinas College named John Berg was in the audience at that vocation retreat, and he decided to sign up, which was a great blessing for us because he ultimately, as you know, became our Superior General and did a splendid job. With that being said, I'll just introduce myself a little bit and say that I was received into Holy Mother Church in 1976. I was raised a Protestant. My family went to a number of different Protestant churches. No real attachment, shall we say, to any particular denomination, but simply you went because you liked the minister, you liked his sermons, and so that's where you went, and that's a fairly typical experience, I think. And I got into a program of studies at the University of Kansas. I won't go too much into that, but suffice it to say at this moment that, like G.K. Chesterton once said, that there are 3 stages to conversion to the Catholic faith. And the first stage is you decide to give the church a fair shake. And the second stage is you run away from it. And the third stage is you quit running. So that's basically how you become a Catholic from another church. And I decided to give it a fair shake. For me, it was, the occasion of it was a Pentecostal tent revival. Now, if you've been raised in the faith, you probably don't know what those are, but maybe you've seen one on a movie or heard about them. So just imagine a great big tent in rural Douglas County, Kansas, and a small organ with a lot of tremolo. You have somebody at the organ, and the evangelist is up there. He's got a Bible and a speaker system, a sound system, and he's doing that sort of sing preaching, which is popular amongst some of the more southern, shall we say, denominations. And he's up there going on about, and God, the Holy Ghost, has spoken to me right now. Can you feel his presence? He's a blowing through the room. And there's a little organ playing, and people are saying amen or shouting amen, whatever the case may be. And he got onto the Catholic Church, that's how he pronounced it, talking about the Catholics, and he began to use all of these old Elizabethan insults and attacks against the Roman Catholic Church, which I'd never heard before, really. Things like the Romish Church is the whore of Babylon. Its Pope is the Antichrist. He has the mark of the beast upon his forehead, and on and on and on. And I began to wonder about this, whether or not this was true, because he said Catholics are damned unto damnation. Now, his English was atrocious, but it was kind of fun, actually, in some ways. By the way, I wasn't Pentecostal. The only reason I went there is because there's this girl I wanted to date, and that was her idea of, what to do. So we went, and actually seeing her at this revival convinced me that, well, this won't go anywhere whatsoever. And as you can tell by the way I'm dressed, I was utterly unsuccessful at romantic relationships. Well, with that being said, I began to wonder, is that true? Is the Pope the Antichrist? Are Catholics damned? And if that's true, and I began to think, well, it might be true, well, then I have to do something about it. And so I was convinced, since the Pope is the center of the Catholic Church, that's who I need to go after. Now, he isn't. I'm sure you know that the center of the Catholic Church is actually the Most Holy Eucharist. But I thought it was the Pope at the time, so I went to the library. I started to read about popes, and I was looking for dirt. And it's not really that difficult to find some pretty scandalous stuff about different popes. And I thought, aha, now I've got them. And then, like Chesterton said, you decide to give the Catholic Church a fair shake. So well, what's the Catholic position on the Pope? I think I'll find that out. And I did. And it doesn't say that the Pope will be a saint. It doesn't say he'll even be a good guy. It just says that under some very narrow parameters, that when he teaches about two subjects, and two subjects only, that teaching would be infallible, that is, without error. Not everything that can be said about the subject, not everything, not the utter complete truth about it, but that whatever he does teach about it would not have error in it. So the next step was to find out what some of these popes wrote as Pope. And then it's very disconcerting to discover that you might have some real rascal, like Alexander X, I think, was the first one that I began to be scandalized. And then I read what he wrote as Pope about faith and morals. And it was quite disconcerting to discover that it was very holy. It's beautiful, as a matter of fact. And so, I'll go to another Pope. I think the next one I chose was Julius II. I'm not quite sure why. Oh, it was because, he was a knight, and his chaplain told him, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And so he stopped using a sword as a pope and switched to a mace. So instead of cutting his enemy's head off, he would smash them to bits. And I thought, well, what a big fat hypocrite. That's just, and yet I have a very different opinion of him now. But at the time, I read some of what he wrote, and I was astounded, again, at how beautiful it was on the subjects of faith and morals. And so I stopped running. The last of the running occurred on March 19th, 1976 at the Benedictine Abbey of Fontgombault in France. I was a student in the west of Ireland for that spring semester. And for a spring break, we went to a monastery, a bunch of these students. It was kind of like a semester abroad from the University of Kansas, this program of studies I was in. And originally I was going to go to the Riviera and with a couple of guys, and we were going to run around on the beach and try and get in a fight with some French guys, or maybe meet some French girls, drink wine, that kind of thing. And that fell through, and this other group says, well, hey, why don't you come with us? We're going to a monastery. And I thought, oh, hold me back. A monastery for spring break, that just sounds great. Well, I wound up going to it and experienced the Mass. I heard Gregorian chant for the first time in my life. And I should say, I had begun to take instructions in the Catholic faith, but really didn't believe yet, because unless you believe in the Holy Eucharist, you're not a Catholic, not yet. And it was at that Mass when the old abbot raised the host high in the air, and the big bell was ringing in the background, the little consecration bell, the incense was going, the monks were bowing their heads in reverence. And I said for the first time in my life, my Lord and my God. I believed. And then that just changed everything. I wanted a career in the Marine Corps at the time, and was already in it. And then that just changed that, well, I have to stop everything, turn around, and become a Catholic priest. And so I was received into the church in 1976, June 26th. It was a strange time, because when I came in, it was like everybody and their brother was walking out. People were just leaving in droves, which I didn't understand, but I think I understand better now. And then joined a diocese in Kansas, was ordained for that, trained in the new Mass, ordained in the new Mass, said it for a number of years. And then there was something else too, and I'll call this a kind of a ghost. That is, I had to do a paper when I was a seminarian. The paper was supposed to be on comparing the traditional offertory with the prefatory, the preparatory prayers, or the I can't remember what they're called now, in the new Mass. And we were supposed to make this comparison. We were supposed to come to the conclusion that, isn't it a great thing that we got rid of that stinky old offertory, and now we have these preparation of the gifts. Yes, that's the name of it. So looking at the two, I'd never seen the old offertory prayers before, and comparing them, I wrote the paper. I said, well, I don't know whatever rocket scientist thought that this was an improvement, but I beg to differ. I think the older prayers are much better. And here's why. Now, God bless the professor. He gave an A+. He liked the paper, but there was a 2-page single-space typed written series of warnings about this, such as the warning of latent Tridentinism, which I didn't know. He said, you're leaning to the Tridentine Mass, and I didn't know what that was. I'd never seen it before. And I was informed by, under no uncertain circumstances, will you continue on this path? I'd even gone out and bought a hand missal. I still have it. It's right, it's to my left, back there. And a St. Andrew's missal, and began to take that to the new Mass and say these prayers. And, well, this is just wonderful. And I thought it was wonderful, but it was my joy was not received very well. So, but like Cardinal Newman said with his conversion, once you've seen a ghost, you can't pretend as if you never saw him. So this haunted me. And I began to read and read and read. And eventually, when I finally saw the first Mass for the first time, it was 5 years after I was ordained. I was ordained in 1985. My mouth was simply open. I couldn't believe what I was. It was just a low Mass in my godfather's house, in his living room. And I was astounded by it, how beautiful it was. So that led to almost, if you will, a second conversion, in that the old Mass and the other sacraments that go with it and the culture which surrounds it, I found to be quite different from what I was used to and in the parish in which I was serving. And I was so overcome by this, I said, well, I need to learn how to do this Mass, and I did. And then strangely enough, my first traditional Mass was in Saudi Arabia. Don't tell the Saudis that they'll have a cow if they find out, because it was actually quite illegal, because I was a chaplain with the 1st Marine Division in the Persian Gulf War. And that's where I said my first Mass. And I had this idea, well, if I just say this Mass once in a while, then it'll take care of this hankering, this interest, this desire that I have. Well, it made everything worse. And ultimately for me, I felt like a guy on a pond where there's two rowboats and he's got a leg in each rowboat and the rowboats start to separate. And he has to make it either I go in one rowboat or the other, or I fall into the drink, but I can't just keep doing the splits forever. Something needs to change. And so I looked around what the options were, and there weren't many, but one of them was the priestly fraternity of St. Peter. And my bishop did not want me to join that very strange outfit.
Spin, run, and
so as a result, I finally, after years of petitioning, was allowed in.
On your dress.
1993. Looks like somebody's trying to join in the fun here, or it sounds like it. Anyway, since I'm running this, if you're listening at this point, I think you're supposed to click on mute on your screen. And then when it comes time for questions or feedback or whatnot, then we'll unclick that. I think that's how this works. Well, so before this conversion, the first one, to the Catholic faith, I had been exposed to an education by the muses, and one of the muses was Euterpe, which is the muse of elegiac poetry. And I loved elegies. If you've never read, for example, or heard Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, a well-known English poet, it's beautiful. Elegiac poetry is superb, but didn't fit the new funeral rite at all. Quite a contrast. But the first time I saw the traditional funeral Mass, the Requiem Mass, I thought, well, this is what I have loved all along. It's the perfection of elegy, true elegy. And so the more I began to discover about the old Mass, the more I loved it. And I'm like a kid in a candy store with it. The more I see about it, the more I learn about it, the more I realize I don't know. I feel like a real beginner at it. But it corresponded to everything that was good and true and beautiful in my soul. And I felt, I'm home. This is it. This is where I belong in this rite. Now, with that being said, I even wrote a book about the Mass because my parishioners kept asking me, they'd ask me these questions like, well, why does the priest start at the right of the altar? And then he goes to the left. And at the end of the Mass, he goes back to the right. And I would say, well, it's a really good question. I don't know. Let me see if I can find out the answer. And so I began to learn about these things, getting interested in the symbolism of the Mass, and ultimately the book that Father Berg mentioned came out, and a lot of people have read it and have been helped by it, thanks be to God. I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic by any means, but I think it did some good. And if, dear listeners, if you wouldn't mind, say a little prayer for me, because I'm just about to finish the second draft of another book, which is a commentary on all the rites of holy matrimony, beginning with betrothal, clear to the anniversary blessing, the nuptial Mass, and all this. And I'm writing it because I looked and looked and looked for such a commentary and could not find it. And so I think that book will do some good. Well, with that being said, let me quote at this point something my godfather once said. His name was Dr. John Sr. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He once said, you must always, St. Thomas says, advert, and that's the word he uses, advert, which is a Latin word, which means you have to turn to the singular whenever you are in abstract knowledge, the singular about which there is no science. So I've no desire to dwell in this talk about no desire to dwell in the abstract, although some things are and must be abstract about the liturgy. But I think I need to advert to the singular, to the particular. So the title of this that Father Berg gave was, why is the Old Mass worth driving 1 hour for? And that's as good a title as any, I think, for a little talk on the liturgy. So I'm going to advert to the singular here. And I had a parish in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And after we'd have a Mass, and then go to another place, and there'd be catechism, coffee and donuts, that kind of thing. And then go back for a second Mass to a church. We were sharing the church with a Novus Ordo congregation. And I stepped outside while people were having coffee and donuts, and here's a lady in a big van. Her name was Allison, and she's folding pajamas. And I said, oh, you know, why are you folding pajamas? And I thought it was, and then I realized all of a sudden, oh, they had to drive 2 hours to get to the Mass almost. And all that I understood then, oh, I get it. You just toss the kids in the van, get them dressed while you're on the way. And she said, yes. And she said, you know, sometimes I get up in the morning, because we've got to get up early to do this. And I get up in the morning and I'm so tired and I think, Father Jackson, you're just not worth it. And then I think about what the Mass is like here in our hometown, and then I get up and we come. So one reason why I think why some people find the Old Mass worth driving an hour for is because of what is the alternative. They don't have much of an alternative where they live. So they think, well, I need something different. I heard from a guy once, he's actually a parishioner here, Our Lady of Mount Carmel in Littleton. And at one point, they had tried several parishes, and it wasn't in this archdiocese, it was someone else. And they go in to pray early, and a lady comes out and opens the tabernacle. She doesn't genuflect. Just opens the tabernacle and takes out a ciborium and opens it up and gives herself Holy Communion and is about to put it back without abluting her hands, her fingers, and sort of has a second thought, and she turns, says in a loud voice to the sacristy, hey, Bob, you want some communion? And you hear this voice coming from this, oh, no, thanks, I already had some. And she said, oh, okay. And said, we're not that.
That's like a kid.
Is that Father Berg?
Father, if you look on the participants list, you can see who's not muted, and you can mute them as the leader.
I can?
Yeah.
Huh. Well, I'll just, well, thank you. So I'll just put that out. If you don't have your thing on mute, I am not savvy with this stuff. This is the first time I've used Zoom. So anyway, and this isn't even I couldn't get it to work on my computer. That's something wrong with the microphone. Anyway, so back to this. That's he sees that. Or for one guy I know, once, he was simply, he went to Mass and the altar girl had some interesting noise. An altar girl had this, what are those things, those little pop-up mirror things that girls have, ladies. And she starts to put on lipstick, this altar girl. And he said, oh, I can't take this anymore. And so we're going to try the Old Mass. They try that, and they liked it, and it turned out quite well. So that's one reason I think we can say why it might be worth driving an hour. But at this point, I'd like to talk about some numbers. This is another thing to think about. I live here in the Archdiocese of Denver. It's a pretty good archdiocese, I think, from top to bottom. I've been here for many years now, and I've come to know the Archdiocese pretty well. I even served a term on the Archdiocesan Presbyteral Council. So I got to work closely with the Archbishop and the Vicar General. I really respect them, they're good men. Now in this Archdiocese, you have all kinds of initiatives, lay initiatives, clerical, whatnot. I'll just list a few, and maybe you've even heard of some of these. The St. Augustine Institute, the Archdiocesan Women's Conference, Communion and Liberation, Centro San Juan Diego, the Catholic Biblical Institute, Endow, Amazing Parish, Dynamic Catholic, Vibrant something, I don't know. So it's one amazing, vibrant, dynamic, all those kind of things. Well, maybe I'm wrong on that. I'm sorry. Maybe there isn't a vibrant thing. Well, it sounds like there should be. Anyway, so there's many of these initiatives, and in them, in each one of them, you'll find many really good, dedicated, zealous Catholics. You find a lot of hard work, a lot of fidelity to the church. You'll find religious orders, priests doing, working in these things. And some of them not just good, I mean exemplary, really good. And that's not even counting the parishes. There's a lot of good parishes here. Parishes are the real backbone of any diocese. And in these parishes, you'll find lots of hardworking priests, religious, permanent deacons, lay ministers. Again, you'll find a lot of zeal, hardworking, and whatnot. And what's the result of all of this? And I would say this archdiocese has more of these initiatives and more of this hard work going on than, this is the 8th diocese I've worked in since I've been a priest. And I think these initiatives and this zeal and hard work is as good or anything I've ever seen. And what's the result? Well, the result is mass attendance is going down. It went down in 2016. It went down in 2017. It went down in 2018. And with each decrease of mass attendance, you go, well, we need to catechize more. We need to do more. And then it goes down again. I don't know what the figures are for 2019, but I understand they went down again in 2019. In fact, just about everything has been going down since about 1965. How can this be? Now, the normal answer you hear is, it's the culture. Now, this culture we're living in, it's a tsunami. No question. It is, wow, it just sweeps aside all different kinds of things. And I never thought I'd see in my life the very strange things. Let's say this fully grown man who is unable to compete in competitive bodylifting. He just isn't doing that well. And he just says, well, I'm actually a woman. And so he competes as a woman, and he just breaks all the records and does great. And that I never thought I'd see such a thing. And that this is actually accepted to some extent is even more amazing. So the culture is an utter mess. And I've no doubt that the culture has harmed many, many Catholics, even some of my parishioners, even some people at your parish. We're not immune to this culture. It's a tsunami. It's very, very powerful, and can just suck people in at a moment's notice. However, that's the normal answer, is the culture. The problem is the culture. But I'm going to say my parishioners are in the same culture, so why aren't we seeing the same numbers? You're in the same culture as everybody else in Rhode Island. I like your state, by the way. I got to be there. I did my chaining in Naval Chaplain School in Newport, Rhode Island, and went around to a number of places. Really enjoyed being back east. It's fascinating. But when I say a decline from 1965, I mean in every sense. The leading Catholic indicators, and when I say this, I mean things like vocations to the brotherhood, the number of converts, the number of Catholic schools, the attendance at Mass, these kind of things. And there are institutes which study these things, such as CARA. And now I'm going to forget what it stands for. The Center for applied research in the apostolate. I think that's what it means. Anyway, they do all these studies on how Catholics are doing. And in every single area, there is decline, except for three. There are three areas of growth since that year, 65, and they are permanent deacons, lay ministers of the Eucharist, and annulments. Those are our areas of growth. That is pretty grim, to say the least. Now, with these other things, we could go into other things. They take like the nuns. What happened to the nuns? It's like they disappeared. Just, even when I came into the church, there were still nuns around. Almost every parish had them, and now it's very rare to find a parish that has any nuns at all. They just left. So what's going on? Let me give one more example on this. There was a book that was written by a lady, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her name, Sherry Waddell, I think is how you pronounce it. And she wrote a book called Forming Intentional Disciples. It was a very popular book. It sold a lot of copies. And in the book, she talks about a program by which somebody can become a Catholic, and it's called the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults, RCIA. And I don't recall that she mentions the name of the cardinal, but she was talking to some cardinal. She says this in her book. And says, you know, Your Eminence, I think those who come into the church through the RCIA, there's a lot of them that leave the church after a short of even only after 1 year. And the cardinal was nodding her head, and she said, I think it's a very high number, maybe 50%. And he shook his head, no, said it's 70% of those who come into the Catholic Church through the RCIA will have left the church in 1 year. That's not a very good statistic, is it? That's what we would call a catastrophe. For example, if you were running a business and you were discovering we're losing 70% of our new clients in 1 year, you would not use the same program. You would make a change of some kind. So now there's a lot of studies that have been doing about this great loss. What about the traditional Mass and everything that surrounds it? And when I say the things that surround it, I mean the other sacraments, the other 7 sacraments and the devotions and things like that go with the Mass. So at a parish which is dedicated to the traditional Mass, what are those numbers like? Well, I did a very informal study, if you will, at this parish. Because I've been here now for 14 years, I can go back in the parish register and I can remember people. I can look and who was baptized, who converted, who got married, and that kind of thing. And basically, what I can say is, at this parish, if you converted to the Catholic Church here, then at least 90% of those converts are still practicing their faith 10 years later. Now there's a gap, there's a bunch of people, I say around 90, because there's a number of people who've moved and I don't have any way to contact them. I don't know where they are, but I'd be interested. So the number might be actually higher than that. That's about the same number. What if you got confirmed here at Our Lady of Mount Carmel? How many of the kids that were confirmed are still practicing their faith 10 years later? And you find it's running about 90%. What if you got married here? What about the divorce rate? As far as I can tell, the divorce rate here is somewhere, it might be as high as 8%. But again, there's people who've moved away. I don't know, have any way to contact them. But I dare say that these figures, these numbers that I'm giving, I mean, you could go to just about any parish that has the traditional Latin Mass and the things that go with it and find the same numbers. I don't think this is unique to this parish. Now, there have been some polls that have been done. And the polls, I don't know if you saw any of the work that Father Donald Closter, who is a priest in, I think he's in Connecticut, if I remember. And he did some polls of a number of other parishes, and we stack up really well. The figures aren't anything like what's going on with the new Mass. And by the way, I'm just going to refer to the old Mass and the new Mass as just for make it simple here. So why these figures? Why are things so much better? Well, first of all, I'm going to say it's not because we priests, say, in the Fraternity of St. Peter, that we're so much better than priests in the Novus Ordo. Maybe we're better than some of them. And quite likely some of them are maybe better than we are, smarter. I know plenty of priests in this archdiocese. They're a lot more intelligent than I am, can run circles around me. So it's not that we're so much better or smarter, wiser. I don't think it's the clergy. I think it's the liturgy and the things that go with it. Now I want to go into this a little bit. Take, for example, belief in the real presence. Because I was talking about that earlier with my conversion when I saw the Mass. I was at this high Mass, Feast of St. Joseph, March 19, 1976. My Lord and my God, I said for the first time in my life. By the way, I wasn't able to move for about 6 hours after that. I think I mostly wept for about 6 hours when I realized our Blessed Lord is the Holy Eucharist. And the tears came out because of things like just this extraordinary, how could I have been so stupid? How could I have been so ungrateful? How could those kind of things? And then at the same time, it was just his mercy that I found utterly overwhelming. I just could barely stand it. That's gone away, by the way, which is good, because after you say the 6:30 Mass and you have to say the 8:30, you can't just stay there for 6 hours. It would be quite impractical to have those kind of feelings. And, this is as I'm saying these things, some people are, they're laughing at other people, or so I'm not sure what that means. Anyway, God bless you all. So the real presence, getting back to this, numerous polls, you've probably seen some of these, say that even amongst practicing Catholics, maybe 30% believe in the real presence. Yikes, that's a disaster. And that's not at all the case. I would dare say when I say the real presence, I mean believing that our blessed Lord Jesus Christ is truly present, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Holy Eucharist. Before the consecration, just unleavened bread. After the consecration, body, blood, soul, and divinity of our blessed Lord, the second person of the Blessed Trinity. And I've never done a poll here in our parish, but I would imagine about 100% believe that. Why is that? Because it's not because of the sermons that we just regularly give sermons about the real presence. But I think there's other reasons. And one of them, the first one, is the liturgy. For example, when you're a child, we know children. They watch everything. They watch and observe very intently all kinds of things, and they imitate. They're great imitators. They see things, and then they do them. I had a parishioner who sent me a little videotape, and here's his little boy playing Mass. He's kind of dressed up like he has this little play altar and everything. He's kind of at the middle of the altar, and he's saying some things, and he just turns around and says, "I'm Father Jackson." It was great. They're imitators. They do that, and they see things. You see. So what is it? Even a very young child, what do they see? Well, if they went to a church and somebody said no genuflection, no reverence of any kind whatsoever, and just said, "Hey, Bob, you want some communion?" They'll see that, and they're not going to imitate it, but they would. They're going to see what? irreverence. That's what they'll see. Whereas if you go to Mass, say at your parish, and Father Berg celebrates the Mass, or you go to mine or any of the fraternity parish, what are you going to see? You're going to see a lot of reverence. You'll see altar boys really trained well, or as best we can train them. You'll see the use of the paten underneath the chin. You'll see that at the Mass, before the priest can touch the Holy Eucharist, he has to genuflect every single time. When he opens the tabernacle, he's got to genuflect. Before he puts the lid on the ciborium, he has to genuflect. He puts the ciborium back in. He has to genuflect. There are all these tremendous marks of human respect and recognition that this is the Lord, and only our Lord there gets the genuflection. So they're going to see that. And I remember there was a bishop once I was talking to, and I put this in my book once, and he asked me a question once: how can I restore reverence to the Holy Eucharist in my diocese? I said, what? And he said, you didn't hear the question? I said, well, yeah, I heard the question. I just want to hear you ask it again, because I've never heard a bishop ask such a good question. That's a great question. So I told him basically, if you really want to restore it, you have to make it a priority. It's got to be something that you want, and then you get to work on it, and you'll figure out some ways. But in the meantime, I was talking to him about these things. And one of the things that I brought up, which he said, oh, we can't do that. But one of the things I brought up was, if you really want to restore reverence to the Holy Eucharist in your diocese, stop giving communion to people in their hands. Now, yeah, he said, well, we can't do that. We've got to be the people. Well, then if you do that, there's just not going to be the reverence. You can talk about reverence till you're blue in the face. The fact is, people have to see it. You have to do it as a priest. And there's nothing like communion on the tongue to induce reverence. And I'm not saying that you can't find reverence at the Novus Ordo. Of course you can. There's parishes around me, some of my neighbors. I'm in a very good deanery, by the way, and the priests, I have great respect for the priests here. And they're very reverent. When they say the new Mass, they're reverent. They're not goofing around, say. But one of the differences is, and I take this, is just talking. That is, before Mass, people are talking in the church and are not silent in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. During the Mass, somebody is talking during the entire Mass. I mean, start to finish. There's a little moment of silence, say, at the consecration. And then after the Mass, once Mass finishes, everybody starts talking again. Hey, Chuck, or Diane, great to see you. You think the Broncos will go all the way this year? And whatever they talk about. And so this talking, it's all the way through. And you can't pray without silence, not really. David says, be still and know that I am God. You've got to have silence for prayer. Now, this problem of silence, I'd say, I don't know if you're familiar with Cardinal Sarah. He wrote a book called The Power of Silence. It's really very good. And in it, he talks about, well, maybe there's some ways we can put silence into the new Mass. But I've actually seen some of those attempts. Some of them are rather humorous. I knew this older priest. It was back when I was a seminarian. It was quite fun. He was a marvelous old priest. And he would put he called it sacred space. Let's have sacred space. And so after a reading, there'd be two readings, what's called a responsorial psalm, there'd be a gospel. And so after the readings, there'd be this period of meditation. Well, after the second reading, it didn't matter who did it or how they did it. after the second reading, we'd have the sacred space, and he would always fall asleep. He'd just conk out, poor old guy. And somebody would be time for the gospel, and everybody's waiting around, and one of the seminarians have to poke him, and he would always, huh? That's always what he said, and then it'd be the gospel. Well, we loved him, and we would simply overlook that. Well, that's just a human thing. So that was an attempt to do it, but it was, when you try to put periods of silence into a conversation, it becomes very, I mean, if somebody's talking to you and they just stop, it's really quite awkward, isn't it? They just stop there. You want to say, is there something the matter? Did you have a stroke? I mean, just something's wrong, you know. So if somebody in the Mass just all of a sudden, boom, let's stop the talking, then the faithful will say, well, what are we supposed to do? Well, you're supposed to meditate on what you just heard. Get on with it. You know, you've only got 50 seconds to do the meditation, so you better get a move on. Well, I don't know, almost nobody can do that. And so these various attempts, I've seen a number of them, they're just not happening. So for the real presence to believe, I mean, everything about the traditional Mass will tell you Christ is truly present in the Holy Eucharist. It doesn't just say it. And also it says very clearly, if you partake of the Holy Eucharist and you are in a state of sin, you will eat unto your own damnation. That's what St. Paul said. And it's blunt. And all the references to bad communions were actually removed from the new lectionary. And I'm not sure why that was. I don't know the history of that. But I can remember as a very young priest giving a sermon once using St. Paul's text, you can eat to your own damnation. And the pastor getting really quite angry about it, he said, you are not in conformity with the lectionary. That's not in the lectionary. You're going outside. You're supposed to preach on use the lectionary and whatnot. And I suppose to a certain extent he was right. Yeah, I guess it is against the lectionary in some way. And that's a shame. Now I'm going to give a second thing. You will discover that the Mass is a prayer. And I would say that is a lot more obvious at the traditional Mass. And there's various reasons for that. One of them, I'll just give one. This is huge. It's saying the Mass facing God, ad Deum, or ad orientem, if you have a church that is, so that you would be facing east. Or sometimes it's called the liturgical east, that kind of thing. So when you start to do that, and Cardinal Ratzinger wrote a lot about this before he became Pope Benedict XVI. He wrote about the problem of the priest and the congregation facing each other is that the community becomes focused on itself. And thus you have all the conversation and all the talking. But in the traditional Mass, one of the first things newcomers who like it, now not everybody that goes to it likes it at first. Some people see it, they're aghast. You know, this is horrible, and that happens sometimes too. But at least they will say, well, yeah, that Mass is a prayer from start to finish.
Amen.
It's a prayer. Then you say, well, what about the sermon? That's not a prayer. True. But notice for the sermon, have you ever noticed how the priest, he takes off his mantle and he lays it either on the altar or he lays it on the missal. And this is to signify to the faithful, we're going to stop Mass for a little while. And then he leaves the altar. He descends down the steps from the altar, because ideally you've got some steps going up to it. And he goes over to the pulpit, and now he's facing the people. And before he gives his sermon, he makes a vernacular sign of the cross. And all of this is to make it loud and clear, we're not at Mass anymore. now it's you and I. This is a kind of conversation in a way. We're going to do this for a bit, and I'm facing you. But as soon as it's over, another vernacular sign of the cross, he turns around, goes back to the altar, and now he's facing God. Now he does turn around several times during the Mass, and actually 5 times. Why does he turn around 5 times? Because that represents the 5 times that our Blessed Lord appeared after his resurrection. So the traditional Mass has a very hidden and complicated liturgical language that it uses. And that's why I wrote my book, to try and explain to people what this language is. So it's just on the symbolism of Mass. So if you go to the Old Mass, you will discover that this Mass is a prayer. Thirdly, when you go to it, you'll discover this Mass is a sacrifice. And it's a sacrifice being offered to God. Again, the ad orientem worship really helps in that, but everything about the gestures, the movements of the priests, everything will indicate this is a sacrifice. It's not a meeting of the people. I was on an airplane once, sitting next to this lady, well-dressed, obviously very intelligent, well-formed woman. And we began to talk, and she said, well, I was raised a Catholic. And I said, well, I bet I know why you left. And she said, well, I didn't leave. And I said, well, actually, you kind of did, because anybody that says I was raised a Catholic means, I'm not practicing anymore. So I said, I better know why you left. And she said, why? She says, well, because you don't know much of anything about the Catholic faith. And she says, well, I wouldn't say that. She says, I went to Catholic schools for 12 years. And I said, oh, well, I rest my case. There you go, madam. There's part of the problem right there. And so as we shared, well, give me an example. I said, okay, what's the Mass? And, the first question I said, what's the center of the church? She said, Pope. And I said, well, no, that's not, or no, sorry. I asked her first, what's the number one doctrine, the number one teaching of the Catholic Church, the most important teaching of all? Well, you know what that is? And she said, the Pope? And I said, well, no, he's not a doctrine, he's a guy. But so it's not the Pope. And I said, what? And she said, what is it? And I said, it's the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, that there is one God in 3 persons. Oh, yeah. What's the principle? The principle upon which all of our practice and everything is built. And she didn't know. And I said, well, it's the incarnation. It's God becoming one of us, taking flesh. I said, let me try a third one. What's the Mass? And she said, well, what do you mean? I said, I mean, what's the Mass? Well, how would you define it? And she said, well, the Mass is, it's like, when the people, they like, get together and they, pray and they like celebrate. And I said, if I thought that's what the Mass was, I wouldn't get up in the morning to go to it either. I mean, I can do that out on the back porch, I think. I could get some friends together and we could celebrate and whatnot. But what if it's Calvary? What if it is the sacrifice of our Blessed Lord at Golgotha, and that the Mass is a way for you to be really present at that crucial, most important event of all of history? If you thought that's what the Mass was, you might just get up in the morning to go and be a part of it, especially if you thought that it had to do with salvation. So when you go to the Old Mass, and especially when you read the texts, I mean, getting back to the offer, that when I first, I presume most of you know that in the new Mass, I don't know if I can remember it, say that at the preparation of the gifts, the priest raises the chalice and he says, I don't remember the exact, blessed are you, Lord God, for we have this wine to offer, fruit of the vine and work of human hands. It will become our spiritual drink. or something pretty close to that. And when I used to say the new Mass, that's what I said. And when I lifted the chalice up, I said, this is going to become our spiritual drink. That's not what I meant. What I meant was, this is going to be the chalice of salvation. This is going to be, what's going to be in this is the precious blood. That's what I really meant. It's not what I was saying. But when I saw for the first time the prayers of the traditional Mass, Oferimus tibi calicem salutaris, we offer unto thee, O Lord, the chalice of salvation. I said, now this expresses what I really believe. This expresses sacrifice. And when you look at the texts of the Mass, and for many people, the first time they see them, they say, whoa, this is really different. From start to finish, we're talking here about a sacrifice to God, and they experience that. And then I would say there is a culture that surrounds the Mass. I mean, just take the music. I've known people who just can't take, say, the guitar music that's at the local parish or wherever they are, and they'll drive an hour to go find some decent music. And by the way, I think ours here is excellent, not due to me, but to an extremely talented music director that we have here, Mr. Rick Wheeler, and some extremely talented singers and a really, really good organist. I mean, we are blessed here. And so the music, people that come, let's say, for the first time, and they're blown away because they've never heard Gregorian chant really used at the Mass. They've never heard the Mass chanted before in harmony with the Gregorian chant. And they've never heard sacred polyphony at the Mass before, and how it all goes together. You know, getting back to the first Mass I went to there at Fontainebleau, back at that abbey, and I'd never heard Gregorian chant before. And the guy's kneeling to the right of me, as soon as it started, and the monks were singing, I looked over at Tony Robertson was his name, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and he says, leans forward, and he says, you know, I don't know what this stuff is, but it's real holy. I said, yeah, you know, it is, isn't it? And I was blown away. But what is this music? Now, there's one other thing I've got to say here and you need to really be patient with people when they're coming for the first time to the old Mass. They're going to be lost at first. It takes about some people 5-6 times to even get the hang of how to go to it. And they'll be irritated maybe because they're lost at first. Well, but be patient with them. They'll get it with a little bit of patience and say, it's not that hard. A few times you'll be able to follow in the missal, and don't worry a whole lot about not being able to follow it at first. But regularly, try and get them to go to the High Mass. Try to get them to hear this. Music is in terrible shape in our age. And in the church, largely, it's in bad shape. So just the question of music, very often, that's a reason to get up and go and drive, or it should be, so that in our parishes, we ought to have really, really good music. Take vestments. I can remember hearing somebody, it's a story, the priest came out and he was wearing a semi-Gothic chasuble. And as it turned, he had brought a friend of his to Mass, and the priest came out, and he was holding balloons, and had the cartoon character Snoopy was on the front of the chasuble, because it was to be a children's Mass, which is a horrific thing, to be sure. You say, okay, well, the vestments make a difference. Either they're sacred or they're just as bland and older. The chalice that's lifted up, is that sacred? Is it beautiful? What about the altar that you're saying Mass? All of these things combined, the music, the movements of the priest. He can't be a sacerdos robatus, you know, this robot-like kind of dominos in the hands just coming out in these jerky movements. He needs to pour some oil on it and try to make it as smooth and graceful as he can. All of these things then combine to really help in so many ways what's going on in the experience of the Mass. Now, I'm going to wind this up here in my talk for a bit and just say a few more things and then open it up for questions. And there's another thing, and we haven't really talked about what's missing from the traditional Mass. But I'll give you one thing that's missing from it, and it is rationalism. If you don't know what rationalism is, I won't go a whole lot into that, except to say that the suffix in English, ism, means to an extreme. So if you say alcoholism, it's the use of alcohol to an extreme, right? That's why I don't really like the word Catholicism. I don't think it's to an extreme, but anyway. So rationalism is taking reason to an extreme. And when I was in seminary, we got a lot of what is called the form critical method. And the form critical method is to say one of its purposes is to demythologize the scriptures. So that, have you ever seen Thomas Jefferson's Bible? That guy was a rationalist. And so in his Bible, every single miracle that was in it was scratched out, because a rationalist said, well, it can't be miracles. We know that much. There's got to be some natural explanation. And I hope you like this story as much as I did, but I heard of this Catholic priest at some ecumenical conference was giving a talk about the crossing of the Red Sea, where Pharaoh's army was destroyed by the flood. And he was saying, well, we now know it's not some big flood of water like in a Charlton Heston movie or that kind, but actually it was a flash flood. And they were in a wadi. And flash floods, the water isn't really very deep. It's very swift moving, but it's sometimes only 6 inches deep. And from the back, this black Baptist minister calls out, hallelujah. It's a great miracle. And the priest was saying, well, no, it really isn't a miracle. I mean, these wadis, they can, and this flash from that, and the miracle. And the minister was saying, it's an even greater miracle, because this means that the Pharaoh and all his army were drowned in nothing but 6 inches of water. Hallelujah. So it's a great response to rationalism. You see. So this kind of business, I got into trouble over this. One day in seminary, we were told that our blessed boy, the incident where he's walking on water and St. Peter sees him and says, Lord, bid me to come to thee. And Lord said, come. St. Peter jumps out of the boat. You know the story. So the professor was explaining how, we know nobody can walk on water. This is very unlikely. He's most likely on a sandbar. And it appeared, you see, that he was walking on water. And so I raised my hand. I said, well, I'm sorry. I'm from Kansas. There are no sandbars in freshwater lakes. Rivers have them, creeks have them, but lakes don't. If there was a sandbar there, it was an even greater miracle, because that means the angels would have had to been up all night long hauling in buckets of sand to build one there, because there's no sandbars in the Sea of Galilee. Well, he did not like that whatsoever. And so this, you see, the rationalism, it undermines the faith. If any priest, say, really bought that drivel, heaven knows what he's going to do at the Feast of the Guardian Angels, or the Feast of St. Michael, or St. Rito. What are you going to do on those feast days? I don't know. But rationalism doesn't fit into the old Mass whatsoever. It fits with the modern age. It fits with the times, this tsunami. It fits with the culture that we're in, that's for sure. But here's a little, if you haven't heard this before, the great quote from G.K. Chesterton. He said, Catholicism, he said the Catholic faith is the only thing that frees a man from the degrading slavery of being a child of his age. We do not want, as the newspapers say, a church that will move with the world. We want a church that will move the world. These are really good quotes. Chesterton is very quotable, as I'm sure you know. And so I would say if the sacred liturgy then is celebrated in an anthropocentric way, that is meaning utterly tied to the times we're in with its music, fashions, whatever, if it does that, then it's just no longer evident that's a divine action. It just simply becomes a social activity that can be relativized along with everything else. So, with that being said, I'm going to end with one more quote and then open it up for some questions. And the quote comes from the late Monsignor Ignacio Pereiro, who lived in Rome. I knew him years ago, a very fine man. And he said this, very sobering words: "Only the man who has roots has a future. Part and parcel of the problems of modern man are that because he has cut his roots with his own past, he can no longer project himself to the future. Man without an inherited and objective frame of reference cannot even make sense of the present in which he lives. To attempt to achieve freedom by escaping from the burdens of tradition tends to result in a new enslavement to a chaotic present." Couldn't agree more. With that being said, let's open it up for questions, because I think I'm supposed to, what time is it? I'm supposed to end this here in a bit, but Father Berg said if anybody does have some questions, maybe we can entertain those. So if you've got a question, turn off your mute button, and I don't know how this Zoom thing works. Maybe raise your hand or just start talking, I think, and then something happens on the screen, I guess. So any questions, comments? Or should I just keep yapping along here? Here we go. Ken, do you have a, no? Oh, yes, the Wassels, did I say that right?
Hi, Father. Thanks so much for your talk. So, I have to confess, I'm a little in awe that you are a student of John Senior. So some of us, some friends of mine here listening to this talk even are really great fans. And I just wondered, for those of us that are home educating our children, do you have any advice regarding that kind of incarnational education that you received from him? And it feels like already tapping into the Latin Mass, we're doing that in a new and different way, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts on it.
Well, we certainly do. The first thing I would say about homeschooling is keep doing it. That's number one. Don't quit. It's tough. It's hard, but keep doing it. It's a wonderful thing in many ways. And this program of studies I was in at the University of Kansas was taught by 3 professors, and John was one of them, Mr. Senior, and also taught by Dennis Quinn and Frank Nellick. And there's a little homeschooler right there. This was essentially education by the muses. And there were 9 muses, as you probably know from, I mentioned one, Euterpe, the muse of elegiac poetry. And the professors thought that one of the things that was missing, and I went to college in the mid-70s, and by the mid-70s, 2 things. One, they had thought the separation of modern man from natural reality was radical by that time. It really was. I mean, by that time you had all kinds of kids who had never, say, sat by a fire. They'd never cooked over an open fire. They'd never ridden a horse. They don't know the names of the stars. They had never caught a fish or shot a deer, or, I mean, just going to rock concerts or something, watching TV, watching Star Trek. there was this ridiculous show called Star Trek at the time in the 70s. It was quite popular. It was this really corny, ridiculous thing with ray guns and rocket ships and whatnot. Anyway, so that's what they're doing at the time. And so one of the things they wanted us to do was to have contact with nature. Now that is super hard to do in a public school, and super hard to do actually at many even private schools or charter schools, but not hard to do in homeschooling. In fact, it's really quite easy. You can go out to the backyard and there's a tree or there's grass. Or if you have a number of kids and they're playing around, there may be no grass whatsoever after a period of time. So as the case may be, but you can have pets. You can have some chickens, say, or rabbits or something, and experience where you can do stargazing. Now, if you live in town, it's not the best. If you really want to see the stars, come out to Colorado. We'll take you up a mountain at night, and man, you'll see the stars. Or you can go out in the deserts, the eastern plains of Colorado, and see them. A little difficult to do sometimes in Rhode Island, but you can still do it there. Now, this was required of us. So in this program, we had to go out and do stargazing. We had to learn the names of the stars. You have another one, an example of this, education by the muses. Nobody knew how to dance by this time. Terpsichore is the muse, the Greek goddess. She was the muse of dancing, and we didn't know how to do it. I mean, we did what we called dancing, but it was with a rock dance, what rock music say, or so you get out there and you sort of gyrate around for a period of time until the thing is over. And then slow dance, and then they would put something slow, and then the couple would sort of adhere to one another and sort of shuffle around until the thing was over. Well, we were required in this program to do the waltz. This was required. And at first we thought, well, okay, we'll do it, because what the heck, you get credit for this, so why not? And what you had to do is the man goes up to, the young man goes up to the young lady and he says, "May I have the honor of your company at this dance?" And then she says either yes or no or whatnot. And notice already, just with this, he takes the lead. He's the leader. And nothing can be done until her will says yes. So then if she says yes, then you turn sideways and you would offer the crook of your arm, and she would put her hand in her, and then you're escorted to out a certain place. And then you have to put one hand on the small of her back and the other hand goes up, and you have to keep a distance between each other. And you have to look into her eyes and all this. And you have to lead, but nothing can be done unless it is her will. So the man in this dance is the leader, but she's the guide, you see. And we didn't know it at the time, but what we were learning was the virtue of chastity by this dance. It's very romantic in a number of ways, but you have to keep a distance. If you cross the distance, you can't do the dance. If you hold her in any other way, you can't do the dance. If she starts to lead, it's as ugly as sin. I mean, women that lead the waltz, it's just horrible to watch. It's a train wreck. So, but all of this, again, there is a certain preparation for holy matrimony. Because in holy matrimony, the man, ideally, he's supposed to be the leader. But the woman has to be the guide. She has to guide her husband to the path where he needs to lead. And so to become one flesh, and this was happening in the dance. And so we just did this. So, ma'am, if you're more interested, Father Berg has my email. You can shoot an email and I'll give you the text of a lecture that I gave on this very subject called Education by the Muses, where I go through each of the muses and how it applies. It was a lecture I gave to a homeschooling conference. So it might, you might find some help in that. Anyway, Father Berg you can contact him, and he can, or you can just look up our parish online, and you'll see in it the how to get in touch by email. Send me, the secretary will forward it to me. I'll send you back, and we'll go from there.
I'll surely do that. Thank you. I know that there will be several of us who will benefit from that, so thanks.
Oh yeah, and then feel free to share it with it. Do you know there were hundreds of converts to the Catholic faith out of that program? Those professors never once talked about the Catholic faith. Lots of vocations to the priestly and religious life, lots of great marriages. They never once talked about the Catholic faith, but they gave the soil. They gave a really good soil that once the seed of the Word of God, and we know from the parable of the sower, don't we, that the seed of the Word of God, it only grows in a certain kind of soil, and they gave it to us, and that's why there were so many converts. So the soil is important, very important. Mr. Gallagher, did you have a?
Yes, thank you, Father, and thank you for being with us. It's just wonderful.
Oh, you're
just to show off, Father, that I've read a few pages of this amazing book. Could you illuminate a little bit more for me and us the difference between active and actual participation, where I understand that the new Mass after Vatican II, we were encouraged in one area that it would allow us to participate. And there is a suggestion in the book that that kind of active participation is in fact a misdescribing of the Latin word, but then it moves into actual. So the difference between active and actual participation.
I think it's an important distinction. First of all, it's not to say that active participation is wrong or bad or anything of the kind. But by active participation, we mean, okay, we're going to all stand together when the gospel is read, say at Mass. We're going to sit during the sermon. We're all going to kneel after the Sanctus or during the Sanctus. So we're actively doing things. It has to do with the exterior. I'm singing the Mass. I'm making the responses while I'm singing the Mass. The priest sings Dominus vobiscum, I sing in return et cum spiritu tuo. That all has to do with the active. And that's a good thing, no question of it. However, anybody can do that. I mean, a pagan could do that. A non-Catholic could go in and sit when everybody sits and kneel when everybody kneels. And they're participating in the Mass in a certain sense, that's for sure, but it is not what is called actual participation. So in the Second Vatican Council, in the document Sacrosanctum Concilium, you find the phrase, it does mention with the sacred liturgy, participatio actuoso, actual participation, which it didn't say participatio activa, it didn't say active, but it got translated into active. So the emphasis has been on for a long, long, long time, active participation. But actual participation, that is only possible for the baptized. That is, for me to actually participate in the sacrifice of Christ, I have to be a member of the mystical body to do that. I have to be baptized. And not only that, I have to be in a state of grace. In other words, if I'm in a state of mortal sin, then my offering of sacrifice to God is not accepted, can't be accepted. It's impossible to make that sacrifice. And our blessed Lord himself refers to it when he says, if you've got something against your brother, go reconcile with him and then come back and make your offering. So that's one reason why we hear confessions during Mass. There was a priest here in the Archdiocese. He found out we were hearing confessions during Mass, and he called himself a liturgist. I'm not really sure what a liturgist is. I have a friend, a priest friend, who defines a liturgist as someone that God sends to any particular church which is not being actively persecuted. So I think that's a pretty good definition of a liturgist. So anyway, he said, "You're here." He just kind of glared at me, and I didn't really argue with him. I just gave a fake toothy grin as a response to him not liking that idea. But notice, if somebody is not in a state of grace, they can do all the active participation in the world and maybe even do it perfectly, and their sacrifice will not be accepted. They need to go to confession. They need to have that mortal sin removed, and then they can make the sacrifice in, through, and with our blessed Lord, the acceptable sacrifice to the Father. And notice that at the offertory, when it's sursum corda, lift up your hearts, or literally in the Latin, hearts up, that means you're placing everything on the altar, your desires, your dreams, your failures, your successes, whatever you're doing in the interior life, and you're placing it on the altar with the gifts to be offered to the Father in, through, and with our blessed Lord, with the second person of the Blessed Trinity, Christ. And the only way you can do that, the only way that is acceptable, is to be in a state of grace. And so that is actually participating in the Mass. And so the good news is, somebody's, well, if active participation is so important, what about somebody in a wheelchair who, because of a big stroke, they can hardly even talk? How are they going to actively participate? The answer is, they can't, not a whole lot. They can't sing anymore. They can't stand up and sit down and do all of that. But they can actually participate on a level that is 1,000 times more valuable in the life of the Church than the most active participator. The person lying on a hospital bed, and the best they can do is watch a live stream of a Mass, and they can barely even hold a rosary in their hands, but they can actively participate. They can actually participate and offer what is happening in their lives as an acceptable sacrifice to God, and that is of tremendous value. So, as you can probably tell right now, I'm not saying that active participation is bad. It isn't. It's good. But the actual participation is more important. It's the greater thing. So I hope I've answered your question. There's more that can be said about this, but that's a good question.
Father, I had a question.
Yes, sir.
We're relatively new to the Latin Mass, about a couple of years now, a year and a half now, and we're so appreciative and grateful for that time. But one of the questions that I've encountered before, and I don't feel like I have a good answer to, is, well, why must it be in Latin? You mentioned earlier, these rich texts that we could benefit from. Why is it important that they be in Latin?
Okay. I've got 2 minutes to answer that question. That's not going to be easy, but I'm so glad you're and there must be a musical background. I see a guitar and on the background there, so which is wonderful. God bless you. But there's a number of reasons for it, and I'll give a very short answer. But I also wish you to. Have you ever heard of Dr. Peter Kwasniewski? Okay, he writes, I think, very, very well about the Mass. And if you were to Google Peter Kwasniewski, Kwasniewski, why Latin? You'll find some really good articles on this. But I'm just going to say this shortly, and then I'm going to close by giving all of you a blessing, because I can give a priestly blessing over the phone or this, and that's acceptable. But one of the things is because it is so fitting to what the Mass really is. The Mass is a deep mystery. The sacrifice of Christ on Calvary is an astounding, deep, deep mystery. As David says in the Psalms, deep is calling on deep, and that's the sacred liturgy. And any attempt, I think, to, and a rationalistic attempt to, let's just strip away as much of the mystery as we can and make this immediately comprehensible to a person, I'd say that's not the Mass. That doesn't fit the Mass. You need a language and a way of going about things that fits that unfathomable mystery. I hope I've just whetted your appetite a little bit to read a little bit more on that. Peter's coming out, I'll make a little plug here. Peter's coming out with a book called Why Attend the Traditional Mass? Or and it's going to go into a lot of these very practical questions like the one you just answered. And he goes through, what about kids at Mass? Why do we do, and he gives rebuttals, excellent rebuttals to many of these things that you hear of people who want to criticize the Mass. Well, with that being said, Father Berg said, I'm done at, I go from 5, to 7. So actually, oops, I think I've gone over a little bit. Let me give you my blessing. And it's Benedictio Dei Omnipotentis, Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti, descendat super vos, et maneat semper. Amen. Go with God, and oremus pro invicem. Let us pray for one another.